Hey there, I'm Sarah from Write Design Lab, and on this channel I make videos about web accessibility and UX design. In this video, we'll be exploring one of the most important issues in web accessibility, text alternatives. I'll break down what that means, how to write alt attributes, and why these practices should be a focus of your content writing process. Along the way, we'll look at a bunch of examples online, discuss who on your team should be responsible for writing text alternatives, and we'll learn how this practice can improve your SEO. So let's get started. The purpose of text alternatives is to ensure that all non-text content is also available in text. This means that any digital content that isn't text, like images, audio files, videos, maps, decorations or decorative imagery, charts, graphs, and images of text, all of these types of things must have an electronic text alternative. So why is this important? Well, electronic text has the unique advantage that it is presentation neutral. Assistive technologies can take any electronic text and present it in a way that best meets user needs. So, a screen reader will read electronic text out loud, presenting it auditorily to users who are blind or visually impaired. Electronic text can also be rendered tactily through an electronic braille output device, or any combination of these, however is best suited for the user. Before we jump in, a quick disclaimer. In this video, I'm focusing on simple, static visuals, such as images, icons, logos, and decorative imagery. I won't specifically address more complex content like graphs and charts or time-based media such as videos or audio files. I'll address those topics in some upcoming videos, so keep an eye out. So let's jump in and take a look at what non-text content is. Right now we're looking at the San Diego Zoo's homepage, and right off the bat we're seeing some non-text content. The most obvious is probably this big carousel banner that's moving through 3 different images. I also see their logo right up top. This links back to their homepage, which is pretty standard. And I also noticed this magnifying glass icon in the top left. When I click on it, it opens the search bar, but this is also considered non-text content. As we continue to scroll down, I see some decorative imagery. This is non-text content. And we continue to see more images, animals that link back to different pages on the zoo's site. Further down, we see this picture of a girl, and it looks like she's playing with this little penguin that's behind some glass. And over top this image is the badge showing that the zoo received a 2018 Traveler's Choice Award from TripAdvisor. This is a great example of an image of text. So we'd be able to confirm that this is in fact an image of text rather than electronic text by looking at the code, which we will do a bit later. But I'll quickly just demonstrate what I mean by image of text. So electronic text, text that is written in code, you can highlight if you click and drag, like I'm doing here on the right, wildlife live cams. These are examples of electronic text. If I try to do that same thing to this text over here by clicking and dragging, you'll see that the whole image is picked up, and that text isn't electronic text, but is in fact an image of text, which is considered non-text content. As we keep scrolling, we see more pictures of animals, more cartoon, decorative imagery, and here we get to logos of zoo partners. These are all considered non-text content, as well as social media icons. These are non-text content. And again, more logos down here. These are all considered non-text content. For sighted users, visual non-text content like this is often taken for granted. Sighted users like myself, we don't consciously register just how much information we're able to consume through imagery and other visual content. But the truth is that without relying on any electronic text, I was able to learn a lot about the zoo site and the zoo itself. I was able to figure out where to search the site. I have an idea about the types of animals they have at the zoo. I learned that they earned a badge from TripAdvisor, and I learned about their corporate partners and so on. So you can imagine that if we don't properly translate these images or other non-text content into electronic text, all of that information and all of that value is lost for users who primarily or solely rely on electronic text via their assistive technology. So I hope now we see why text alternatives are important, but how do we implement them? Well, text alternatives can be provided in 2 ways. One, within the code by writing a concise description of the visual in the alt attribute of the image element. Or 2, we can give enough context from the text surrounding that visual. So let's just get into it and talk about alt attributes. This is the homepage of the New York Public Library's website. The New York Public Library does a lot of great work with the disability community, and their site is a great place to explore if you're looking for good examples of alt attributes in the wild. And that's exactly what we're going to do right now. So right off the bat, we see a lot of non-text content, just like in a lot of websites. And we'll start by looking at this banner image. So let's jump into the code and look at its alt attribute. And to do that, I'll right-click and inspect this image. For those who don't know, this opens a dev panel on the right, and this shows all of the code for this site. And as you can see, as I scroll over the lines of code here, it highlights the corresponding UI components on the left. So right here, we see the HTML for the banner image, and right here, we see the alt attribute for this image, and it reads, Marble Lion Statue in Front of Library Building. This is a great example of a short and sweet alt attribute. It doesn't dwell on extraneous details like how the picture kind of looks like it was taken on a gray winter day, or that the lion is sitting prone with his paws out in front. These details don't give value to a user using assistive technology in this context. Now, let's move on to this example here. The link text reads, Missing Sounds of New York. And we can see that its alt attribute reads, Rendering of record with NYPL lion logo coming out of sleeve that reads, Missing Sounds of New York. Now, relative to the alt attribute that we just looked at, this one is a bit more descriptive, but for a purpose. For one, the alt attribute describes that there's a vinyl, and so perhaps this is a physical product that we can buy. The NYPL Lion logo shows us that it's a production of the library. And 3, the alt attribute describes the text on the record sleeve to show what the record is called. What's great about this example is that the alt attribute describes the image in a way that's comparable to what sighted users see and experience. It doesn't tell us that this picture is of a record that the New York Public Library produced and it's called Missing Sounds of New York. Rather, this alt attribute describes the image in a way that allows users to come to their own conclusions about the content, just as sighted users do when they come across a picture or an image like this. Looking further down, we'll go to our next example, to this link here. The link text reads, Get a digital library card today. And the alt attribute for this image reads, Close-up of someone holding an NYPL library card. Again, this one is pretty short and sweet. Details about the color or the design of the card are left out. We're not talking about the composition of the image, that there are books that are out of focus in the background. We don't mention these details because they're irrelevant and shouldn't be included in this context. It's safe to say that in another context, these details about the card or the composition of the image may be important to include, but in this case, they aren't and should be left out of the alt attribute. And our next example, we're going to go right below here to look at this link and image. The link text reads, Online Learning and Skills Training for Adults. Looking at the alt attribute of this image, it reads, Trainer and student working on a tablet computer together. This alt attribute also gives a lot of information subtly. One, we can gather that there's a one-on-one training available, presumably. It's not a classroom setting full of adult learners. And 2, this alt attribute also tells us that learning is facilitated, at least sometimes, through tablets. Not sitting at a desktop computer or not looking at a phone necessarily. I like this example because for me, it highlights how much information sighted users take in through non-text content, whether we realize it or not. And it also demonstrates how properly written alt attributes can just as easily supply that information for people using assistive technology. And before we move on to the next portion of the video, I'm going to take a quick look at how to deal with images of text. And right here we have a link that reads Best Books, and the associated image reads the New York Public Library Best Books of 2019. And if we look at the alt attribute of this image, it reads Best Books of 2019. So generally speaking, images of text shouldn't be used because, as we're learning in this video, it's not best practice for making accessible content. However, This example shows us that when images of text are used sparingly and supplemented by appropriate alt attributes, they're usually just fine to use. Now, before we move on, I want to point out that when writing alt attributes, there's no need to say image of ... or link to our Twitter page or icon showing a magnifying glass. That's because assistive technology will already share this information with the user, either before or after reading the alt attribute itself. So adding that type of information, sort of descriptors about what the content is, whether it's a link or an image, adding that within the alt attribute itself is actually redundant and only adds clutter to the user. Also, I want to add that adding alt attributes on your images will help improve the SEO for your site. SEO is the art of making content seen on search engines like Google or Bing. Basically, search engines look through the text of your site and use that content to determine what your site's about and when to provide it as a search result. Along with implementing image title and file naming best practices, investing the time in writing alt attributes should be an integral part of your SEO strategy. While search engine image recognition technology is getting better, search crawlers still can't really decipher the images on a website all that well. So if you want to ensure that search engines index the content of your site properly, writing alt attributes can really help. And I just want to note that although alt attributes do live in the code of a site, you don't need to be a programmer to implement or write an alt attribute. In fact, for me, there's no question that whoever is responsible for writing content for your site should also be responsible for writing alt attributes. As we've seen, writing text alternatives requires a thorough understanding of all the content on a page and its purpose. So I'd recommend making the content team, whoever may be playing that role, they should be responsible for alt attributes and text alternatives. Now we're going to head over to the career page to take a look at how it's possible to actually leave the alt attribute empty and give all of the necessary text alternatives with just the surrounding text. So right here we see an image that links to a video about Javier Velez. If we peek into the alt attribute of this image, we see that the alt attribute is actually empty. This is because all of the alternative text needed for this image has already been provided by the surrounding text content. So I'll go into a little bit about what I mean by that. For one, the header of this section already provides context for what this section is about. We're going to hear some personal stories from employees themselves. Two, Javier's name and position are already provided in electronic text below his image. So in a circumstance like this, adding any text within the alt attribute probably wouldn't give any additional value to the user, and we can leave the alt attribute blank. In doing this, we're essentially hiding the image from the assistive technology and thus the user. Let's take a look at one more example here. Under the frequently asked questions section, we see a link to employment benefits. And if we take a look at the alt attribute of this image, we see that, again, it's blank. Just as in the case above, this image of people sitting around a table is more decorative for sighted users than informational. It doesn't really give any value in this context of employment benefits. And just like before, we should leave the alt attribute blank for this image in this context. Now, I want to be clear that in this situation, when we feel text alternatives are adequately provided by surrounding text, then the alt attribute should be left empty or blank. It should never be removed completely from the code, and I'll tell you why. When an image doesn't have an alt attribute, when it's removed from the code, as I'll do here, if I were to remove this alt attribute, assistive technology will look for another name by which to call an image or non-text content, and usually it's the file name. And we can see in this example that the file name is 567 benefits. It's the last part of this image source URL. And you can imagine that if you're a screen reader user and every time you come across an image, it's reading the image file name, well, at the best, that's annoying or a bit confusing. But at its worst, this mistake, especially if it's occurring numerous times throughout your content, can make your site incomprehensible and potentially drive away users who are using assistive technology. So just so I'm loud and clear, any non-text content should always have an alt attribute. It's up to the content manager to decide what text is appropriate to put in that alt attribute, or if that alt attribute is better utilized when it's empty. Now, before wrapping up the video, I want to take a quick second to talk about automatic alt text generators. I'm going to make a blank statement here. If your goal is to improve accessibility, do not use automatic alt text generators, and I'll tell you why. So, if you're unfamiliar with these products, essentially there are many companies today claiming to have automatic alt text generators. Generally speaking, companies claim that these auto generators will detect the contents of an image on your site and automatically write alt text for you. Sometimes they're free, sometimes you pay for them, sometimes they claim to use AI or other proprietary tech, but they all promise to save you time by doing the heavy lifting of writing text alternatives. As amazing as these alt text generators sound, they don't work. And I hope that after watching this video, you may have an idea why. For one, alternative text isn't simply about describing images, as many of these generators claim to do. As we've learned, the purpose of alternative text is to translate context-specific information conveyed by an image into text. Remember that context is what's important. And two, even if the generator claims to do more than simply describe an image, it's safe to say that the tool alone won't be adequate given today's technology. I'd like to hope that one day, yes, AI hopefully will be at the point where alternative text and alt attributes can be generated automatically. But there's just no way to rely on today's technology alone to successfully navigate the numerous variables and considerations that come into play when writing text alternatives. So there it is. That is our basic overview of text alternatives. I know it was a lot of information, so here are 5 key takeaways. 1. Text alternatives are an important part of content writing that ensure all users can access non-text content and understand their meaning in context. 2. There are 2 ways to provide text alternatives. You can provide text alternatives by writing alt attributes or by providing descriptive surrounding text. 3. Remember to ask yourself these questions when addressing text alternatives. Why did we put this non-text content here? What value and/or information does it give to sighted users? And how do we convey that same value and information in text, most comparably and efficiently? 4. When writing an alt attribute, leave out any descriptors like image of ... or link to ... 5. Always use an alt attribute, even when it's best utilized when it's left empty. So that wraps up today's video on text alternatives. I really hope you learned something. Please feel free to pass this along to your UX designer friends or web accessibility friends. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.